So, the question we're going to talk about today is tell me about your first job. What did you do to learn the ropes? I personally love this question. I ask this question in a lot of the interviews that I do with others because I think it tells me a lot about the individual that I'm speaking to. So, as always, we're going to start by saying, why are they asking you this question? I think there's really three things that people are looking for here. The first is they want to understand your work ethic. That's the reason I ask this. I say, well, I've been working since I was in middle school. What about you? What kind of person are you? There's no right or wrong here. Not everyone has had to work since middle school. Not everybody, some people are doing too many sports or whatever to work since middle school, and that's okay. But I'm looking to understand what you think about work and what your work ethic is like. I want to know, as always, if you're a fit for the role. That is super important, right? We say all the time, nobody cares about you. So same thing here. Nobody cares about you. They care if you're going to be a fit for the role. So it's always important to think about how you can always use every situation to say, I am a fit for this role, even if it's subtle. And lastly, they want to know if you can learn quickly. This question is really about learning because even if you did something super similar to the role you're interviewing for in your last job, there are going to be differences. And I want to understand, will you pick up on them quickly? So those are the things we want to talk about: work ethic, fit for the role, and fast learning. So the first thing I want to say is just a reminder that you control the narrative here. You have full control over what you want to say and how you want to say it. So if you want to talk about babysitting in middle school because you think that's most relevant, great. But if during college, if growing up in middle school and high school, you babysat and lifeguarded and were a camp counselor, but you're interviewing for a role in the retail sector, and it wasn't until college that you actually got into retail as a cashier, remember, you control the narrative. You get to decide what it is you want to say. And just because they're asking you about your first job doesn't mean you have to really give them your first job. They're asking about an early job, and you can use that. You can control that narrative however you want. So the recommendation here is try to be, and we're going to talk about try to be relevant to the role, but remember that you control this narrative and you can decide what you want to talk about and which parts of it you want to talk about. I was a lifeguard, and so very often I use my example. And there's two parts to being a lifeguard. There's the genuinely hard work of staying alert, getting in early, cleaning, managing customers who are upset because you're not letting their 2-year-old kid dive off the diving board, even though Oliver can't swim. And I've told you so many times that Oliver can't swim, but you keep letting Oliver dive off the diving board. There's that part of it. And then there's the other part of it, which is like chilling by the pool with your friends. I control the narrative. I'm going to leave out the hanging out by the pool with my friends and talk about the hard parts and the specific parts that I think are most important. Next, I want you to try to tie it to the position. And sometimes this might feel impossible. How do you tie being a lifeguard or a cashier, or even maybe it's your first job out of college and you're talking about being a copywriter or an ad agency or whatever? How do you tie that to what you're doing now in your career 5, 10, 20 years later? Well, I think it's really important to remember that you have grown into this particular role. You are somebody who has evolved into who you are today. And everybody knows and recognizes that. So when you think about which position you want to pick, when you think about which parts of that position you want to talk about, do your best to tie them together. So, maybe you want to talk about babysitting. And the parts of babysitting you want to talk about are the management skills and the chaos management that you learned while babysitting. Maybe it's lifeguarding that taught you organizational skills. Maybe you want to talk about how your first job at college gave you a great appreciation for mentoring, and that's followed you throughout your career. So I know sometimes it's weird, right? If you're interviewing to be a secret agent at the CIA, I don't know how you're going to tie babysitting to that exactly. But maybe talk about, well, you have to think fast, be responsible for others, work late at night sometimes, whatever. Try to tie it. Don't be too on the nose and too annoying about it, but try to subtly tie it to what you're going to be doing in this next role. Now, this question is really about learning, right? No matter what. Maybe they don't even say, what did you do to learn the ropes, right? Maybe they just say, tell me about your first job. The questions about learning. I want to know, how hard is it going to be for you to do this job? How do you approach new jobs? How do you think about these things? So your goal here is to talk about that you can learn things quickly and you can handle newness. You can handle the chaos that comes in the first 30 or 60, 90 days. I am not going to have to micromanage you because you've done this before. And this is where great communication comes in. Sometimes you really got to say it quite bluntly. But oftentimes, if we use the right stories, the right words, we're thoughtful in our approach, we can actually plant those subtle seeds in the mind of the person we're interviewing with to tell them, I know the question behind the question. I know what you're looking for, and I am that person. And here's examples of how I'm that person. So my recommendation here when you're practicing this, try out a few different roles. Try out the babysitting gig and the lifeguarding gig and the whatever lemonade stand, and try out how those different things taught you different skills and what you learned from them. Because they don't really care exactly what you choose. I'm not going to call your mother and ask, were you really a babysitter that summer? Nobody really cares. They just want to know that you're going to be good for them in the future. So give those examples of what you learned and how you did it. And that's the last part of this, right? We always talk about storytelling. We always talk about how important it is to be specific and memorable. Because if you just answer this, oh, yeah, so my first job, well, I was a lifeguard and I read the manual and that was my first job. Great. Like you were kind of specific, but nobody really cared. So you want to go into, I think there's two ways to tell this story and be memorable. The first on the left, here's the challenge I had and here's how I overcame it. My first job was being a lifeguard. And the hardest thing was that there was actually no manager that summer. So I realized someone had to step up and be a manager. And I decided to do that because I was head lifeguard and I took that over and I created spreadsheets, yada, yada, right? You can give the specific challenge and how you overcame it. Or you can do the one that's more on the right. That's actually a real photo of my father. Don't tell him I use this. You can do the one on the right, which is more about what's the philosophy that you learned, right? For many of us here who are in the middle of our careers, this was, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, depending on the story that and the job that we're picking. Well, what's the philosophy that you learned? What did you pick up when you were a 15-year-old lifeguard or a 20-year-old retail clerk in college or a 22-year-old in your first job? What's the philosophy that you learned about work, about this role, about this industry that stuck with you forever? Because I'm not going to remember that you were blank. I'm going to remember how you felt about blank and make me feel like you really learned a lot, like you're really going to be the perfect person for this role and this job because of your accomplishments before.